Good morning. What a delight, honor, and a privilege to be back here in Southern Chapel. I love your president. I said this all over the world. Dr. Albert Mohler is truly God's gift to the Christian church in the 21st century. Seldom have I seen or known anyone in whom God has placed so many gifts, so many talents, and yet all in humility. And so I'm honored that you invited me to come and speak. Again, I'm sorry we got snowed in Atlanta, and I tried every possible way to get out in February. I couldn't, but God's timing is perfect. I'm glad to be here, and I salute the Jenkins family and their vision, especially in tying the center with a school that is renowned around the world for absolute orthodoxy and biblical fidelity. I couldn't think of a better place anywhere in the world for the center to be placed in order to safeguard the vision of reaching the Muslims for Jesus Christ. I have to make a confession to you as somebody who's been preaching for 27 years in one church. It's not very often do I go out and talk about the subject, and yet really it's a subject I spent a lot of years studying and experiencing. In 1982, when I was writing my dissertation at Emory University, I ended up going and spending time clandestinely with a group called Al-Qaeda. Back then it was called Jihad. And I had to do all kinds of maneuver to get to their mind and to understand. And the professors, the examining committee at Emory University, two Jewish men, who were wonderful men, and one of them remained a very dear friend, Dr. Stein, he said, why are you doing this? This is cutting edge stuff. Are you going to academia? I said, no, I have a better job. I'm preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. But anyway, we ended up, and the book was published literally before my dissertation was approved by E.J. Brill in Holland. It's called Revolt Against Modernity. And at the forum, I hope that I'll be able to say more about this and and answer some of the questions that probably will not be covered. I wanted really to give you kind of a very broad, because I don't know, some of you probably have read stuff, some have not, and because not knowing this, I try to cover everything in a highlight form and hopefully get to the deeper issues at the lunchtime. Because there is no way you can truly comprehend Islam without understanding the history of Christian heresies. The two are tied together. And what an appropriate thing in this school that upholds the authority of the Word of God to understand the danger of heresies. Not just for what it does now, but what it does for the next generation. As many of you know who are studying church history, the first 500 years of Christianity, the church was plagued by a number of heresies. Many of those are being redressed in a nice clothes right now and sort of dusted off, and they're invading the church again. These heresies have mostly to do with the nature of the Trinity. More importantly, it has to do with the nature of Christ. And there were so many, but let me just give you three as a highlight. Arianism reached its zenith at 320. An Arian who was in Alexandria taught that Christ had two distinct natures, his humanity and his divinity, and he taught that only the Father is eternal, and therefore the Son could not possibly be infinite. Therefore, the Son was created. And that is why in 325, the Council of Nicaea met with all the leaders of the church, and particularly Bishop Athanasius, who fought Arian tooth and nail in the Church of Alexandria. They were there and formulated the Nicene Creed in response to that terrible heresy. Then there was Nestor, or Nestorius, as some pronounce it. He was the bishop of Constantinople between 428 and 431. Nestor insisted that the human Jesus was crucified, and therefore atonement is not divine. That the father-son relationship is only spiritual, but they did not share the same nature. Some form of Nestorianism, believe it or not, remain even to this day in some of the Assyrian Orthodox churches. The Council of Ephesus in 431 was condemned Nestor as a heretic, and many of these churches in Egypt and in Palestine and Syria and Lebanon pushed the Nestorians out of their territories, and believe it or not, most of them ended up in northern Arabia. I'm coming back to that. But perhaps one of the most significant heresies of the church that gave direct rise to Islam is what is known as Ebionites. Now, you would think that after Paul condemned the Judaizers in the epistle to the Galatians, that kind of teaching, which he called it anathema, or be accursed, and all of that would have disappeared. But indeed, it grew, and it grew further south, and it spread to largely some Jewish tribes who added Jesus to Judaism. And that mixture of corrupt Christianity and Judaism, but really more Judaism than Christian, is what influenced Muhammad, the founder of Islam, the most. As a young man, Muhammad himself heard the bishop of Najran named Qas preach Ebonite heresy, but he thought that was Christianity. But because of the limitation of time, there are a lot of books out, and you can follow this. I want to really concentrate in this short period of time twofold. First, to let you know that what you believe is of uttermost importance. You say, Michael, well, you're preaching to the choir here. That's all right. Sometimes choir members go array, so I want you to remember what I'm saying. Why? Besides the obvious, is that modern-day heresies in the church, from heterodoxy to universalism to hyper-grace to emergent church to the insider movement, and all of those heresies are not only dangerous in themselves, but what they will lead the next generation into that is probably even more dangerous. For it is a Christian heresy, this heresy of Ebionites, gave the rise to Islam. And the second thing I want to emphasize or highlight is that Islam today, particularly in the form of Islamists, is one of the two most dangerous threats to the Christian church. The second one is, of course, secular humanism. I wish I had many hours to get into this, but let me summarize fast. Muhammad was born in Arabia, 570 AD. His early life really was filled with tragedy. His father died at the age of 1. His mother died at the age of 6. He went to live with his grandfather, whom he loved. He doted over him. His grandfather died at the age of 8, when he was 8. Then he went to live with his uncle. And as a child, Muhammad suffered from epilepsy. But back then, they did not understand that it is a medical condition because of the fear of being associated with demon possession. In Mecca, Muhammad belonged to a large tribe, very powerful tribe, called the tribe of Quraysh. But this tribe really was made of two clans. There was one clan that is rich and powerful, and then another clan that was poor and weak. Muhammad belonged to the latter. The rich clan had the ownership of the running of the Kaaba. Kaaba is the worship center of the gods, of polytheism. They controlled the Kaaba, and therefore they controlled the fees that people pay to come to pay homage to these gods. And that richer clan oppressed the poorer one. Later on, Muhammad would concentrate his war against his rich cousins, against the other clan. But instead of it being a war between rich and poor, it ended up being a war between polytheism and monotheism. Many of the so-called Allah's revelations or orders to Muhammad about fighting and killing, which you see it and you hear it now. 30 years ago, I had to really go to a great length to explain this, but now it's in the news every day. But most of these surahs that supposedly came were fashioned around that time when he was fighting with his rich clan relatives. More importantly, as a young man, Muhammad lived with his uncle, and therefore he learned his trade. It's whoever you're living with, you learn that trade, and the trade was basically trading. They were taking spices and goods into Syria and Palestine and bringing stuff from there, and they were going back and forth, and he was trading, and he was very clever as a trader. His first boss was a woman who was 15 years his senior, whom he married. She was 40 while he was 25. And she was a business owner. She owned this trading company. And he ended up marrying her. But in his travels, all to Syria and to Palestine and what's the Nabatean kingdom, which is really in Jordan today. If you ever traveled to Petra or read about Petra, that is the focus and the center of the Nabatean kingdom. And it is my personal opinion, when Paul said, I went to Arabia, I think he went to the Nabatean kingdom. It was a very advanced city at that time and spent time there. But as he traveled to Syria and as he traveled to these so-called Christian lands, he saw the icons and he saw the bell ringing in churches and images, and he heard the Jewish shofar being blown. And later on, you see that in his confusion, about what form of Christianity, it came from what he watched Christians doing in these towns in Syria and Palestine, because he saw them there bowing to Mary, and then they were bowing to the Father, and they're bowing to the Son. And then he said, these Christians, they must believe the Trinity is the Father, Mother, and Son, which he vehemently refuted and defended the virgin birth. Back then, of course, they believed that the demons, whom they call gods, had intercourse with human women and produced children who referred to as the children of the gods. And he said, far be it from Allah to do that. And therefore, Mary must have been absolutely virgin. As I said, he defends the virgin birth. But Muhammad's life really can be summarized into 3 stages. The first stage, when he was being discipled by Waraka, who is Khadija's, that's his wife, the one I already mentioned, her cousin. He was a monk. He was an Ibnite monk. And he was discipling Muhammad to become a priest in that Ibnite Christian heresy church. And he taught him the Old and the New Testament, and he began to learn not in the Orthodox understanding of the Old and the New Testament, but in a distorted form. He taught him about monotheism. He taught him all these things, and he began to understand, and he began to see himself that all he wanted to do is basically try to help the Arabs to understand the God of Moses and the God of Jesus. But then came the second stage, in which this monk, Waraka, died, and he became so confused. He didn't know where to turn, where to go. The death of Waraka left Muhammad to be bereft, bewildered, and depressed. As a matter of fact, there was a documentary just a couple of weeks ago on a BBC documentary talking about that period of time. And it was an identity crisis, because a Muslim narrator, of course, putting his own spin on it. It wasn't an identity crisis, it was a confusion of where do I go from here? The man who's been discipling me is dead. And he did not know which way to turn, especially as the opposition to all his teaching about the one true God heated up on the part of his cousins on the tribe, the other clan. In his depression, he began to contemplate, who is he? What is he supposed to do? What is his mission? Is he really want to change Arabia and make them more like followers of the God of heaven, the God of Moses and Jesus? Into the second stage in his life. In the second stage, he began to see himself, probably I'm equal to Jesus and Moses. And in fact, he reasoned, Moses was a prophet to the Jews, Jesus was a Messiah of the Christians, then I must be called to be a prophet to the Arabs. At that moment, he believed that he was preaching the same message as Moses and Jesus. And he called the tribe of Quraysh to turn to the one true God, Allah. Then comes the third stage in his life, when he had to flee Mecca to go to Medina, and there the third stage has begun. And this really is of uttermost important stage in Muhammad's life, because to this day, it's what influences what all you see on television, Islamists, extremists, fundamentalists, and I don't know what the word media come up with, but you know what I mean. And it began about 623 AD. After the initial acceptance of him by many of the Jewish tribes, the largest tribe and the strongest, after some thought, they realized they made a mistake. And they turned on him and rejected him. And so when this is really truly the beginning of trouble. And so what he did, he killed all the men of that tribe. Sometimes referred to as the tribe of Karaja, other times it's pronounced Karisa. He killed all the men, sold the women and the children into slavery. Up until this point in the life of Muhammad, he followed the Jewish customs. They were praying 3 times a day. They were facing Jerusalem when they prayed. Saturday was a holy day, and obeying the feast of Ashara, which is in Leviticus 23:27, fasted only for 10 days, and then using the Jewish shofar to call people to pray. Up to this point, when that Jewish tribe turned on him, everything's changed. He said, we're going to go one better. We're not going to only pray 3 times, we're going to pray 5 times a day. We're not going to face Jerusalem anymore, we're going to face Mecca. Saturday gave way to Friday as a holy day. Fasting changed from 10 days to the whole month of Ramadan, and then the shofar gave way to the izan, or the call to prayer. After Muhammad became successful in defeating his richer clan cousins, he victoriously declared himself no longer to be equal to Moses and Jesus, but he is superior to both of them. Any prophet who came before him, or any teaching that is contrary to what he taught, is to be superseded by what's in the Quran. And it's the best known secret. There were many Qurans. There were many Qurans, many papers everywhere, written on camel leather and all kinds, until the second caliphate, the second successor, burnt a whole bunch of them and kept just one. He said any book, namely the Old Testament or New Testament, which he commended for people to read, he said, but if there is a contradiction, then what he has to say must be accepted, for those words in the Old and New Testament must be falsified. Let me stop here just for a moment. Since all of the teaching regarding the killing of enemies supposedly came by a revelation from the Archangel Gabriel, and to establish monotheism in Arabia. Today, this very subject that you see in the news is creating a huge debate among Muslim scholars. Some of them have converted to Christianity. One former professor of Sharia at Azhar University just wrote a book. He's in hiding right now. And I don't know whether to thank him or not, but he dedicated it to me. When I was overseas in a Western country that shall remain nameless, and I was speaking to a large crowd, he was in the crowd, he came over and he said, "You impacted my life. I watch you every day on television. I just want you to see." And I read this in Arabic and I said, "Boy, where are my bodyguards?" But it's creating, this whole subject's creating a huge debate right now. So many of the moderate, you hear them as moderate, but they are modernist thinking within Islam, are saying that these killing of the infidels, these supposedly revelations that came, they were only revelations meant for Muhammad, and they're only meant until the establishment of the religion. But they're not bound on all Muslims all the time. The others who grab the headlines in the media, the extremists, Islamists, fundamentalists, and all those names, they say, no, 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 no. These orders to kill infidels and be rewarded for it or subjugate them, it's for all time in all places until Islam becomes dominant globally. Now, this is something new for me, so I want to share it with you. What happened in Egypt 13 months ago was so unique in order to enforce this particular debate that I just mentioned. I, for one, must confess to you that for many, many years, I felt that these Islamists, the purists, the fundamentalists, the extremists, or whatever they may call them, they are the ones who have the upper hand because, for one thing, they're scaring everybody else. They're terrifying even those modernist Muslims, and they were in hiding, some of them. Not long ago, the retiring BBC head was interviewed, and they asked him the question, "Why are you so hard on Christians?" So BBC is, and yet you never say anything negative about Islam. He said, "Are you crazy? Christians have broad shoulders, they can take it. But if we say anything negative about Muslims, they will show up on Oxford Street and they will kill us all." I said, how truthful that is. Honest. But until recently, my thinking was that because of the violent nature of the Islamists and the advocacy of violence, not only in the Arab world, but for the rest of the world, that modernist Muslim thinkers will lose in the end. Until I saw June 30th, 2013, where 33 million Egyptians took to the streets in all of the major cities rejecting Islamist rule by the Muslim Brotherhood, which was only there for 12 months but brought the country economically to its knees. And that really brought out this modernist in force. What does that mean? Are we out of the woods yet? I don't think so. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden all these Islamists, they said, "Oh yeah, well, since this is now becoming more common thinking." In fact, that is forcing them to become more extremist and more violent. Again, at the forum, I'll be happy to share with you how these social movements, from the Wahhabis to the Muslim Brotherhood to the Takfir wal Hijrah to Jihad to Al-Qaeda to ISIS, how these progressively become more and more violent in reaction. And so, not by any stretch of the imagination, we have turned the corner in terms of the violent part. This is a globally well-funded movement, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon unless God intervenes. In fact, now that they are being challenged by the secular government of Egypt, things become more dangerous. Well, let me give you some of the thinking of current Islamist thinking, where I, as I said, spent 2 weeks listening to them. And I remember one time in 1982, when they said to me, "Write this." They knew I was writing a dissertation. They said, "Write this." And they wanted me to write some things that absolutely contradictory of all of our Western secular mind thinking about Islam. And they said, we want you to write it because we know exactly where you live. I mean, I'm telling you, I did not sleep that night. But let me give you some of their thinking. In their mind, since Allah gave His final and last and best revelation to Muhammad, therefore the previous revelations must surrender to Islam. By the way, Islam has nothing to do, the root word has nothing to do with peace or salam. It is rooted in the word of submission or surrender. In the case of refusing to surrender on the part of the people of the book, Ahlul Kitab, or the Jews or the Christians, there is another option left, and that is they become dhimmis. Dhimmis meaning second-class citizen or protected citizen, as long as they pay a jizya, which the word does not mean taxes, it means punishment, it means penalty. And it could be up to 50% of one's income, in addition to the normal taxes. It's a form of humiliation of Jews and Christians, and clearly the implication is the superiority of Islam. Even to this day, if it's going to cost $1 million to build a mosque in Europe, but it's going to cost $2 million to buy a church that has been closed down, like many of them are in Europe, and turn it into a mosque and remove that cross and put the crescent, they would rather spend the $2 million because that is the highest form of superiority, expression of superiority. One of the Islamist satellite television stations, I saw that with my own eyes, only 18 months ago, when the Muslim Brotherhood were ruling Egypt. These Muslim scholars, the Islamist scholars, many of them in prison right now under the secular government, were having this discussion. And one of them said, this $2 billion that America pays Egypt, that's a jizya, that is a penalty. That is because America is an infidel country. And if they want to avoid the wrath of Islam, they better keep paying that jizya, that $2 billion. And believe it or not, during the Obama administration, during the time of the Muslim Brotherhood, they increased the amount of money that was given to Egypt and now suspended that there is a secular government in place. I will move on. Because that's probably was one of the most depressing things I've seen in the news. They said that is Americans' way of being punished for being an infidel country, giving us that money. The third jihad, and that's another important word that you must understand. What is the third jihad? Well, that means there was a first, second, and then this is a third. The first jihad was back in late 600s, early 700s, when the Muslims came out of Arabia under Caliphate Omar, the second successor of the Prophet, when he invaded traditionally Christian lands, and they did exactly what you are seeing on television today, that they're doing to Christians in Mosul. It's exactly, as I said, 30 years ago, I had to explain to people, I said, really? They gave them 3 options? Yeah, now I don't have to. You're seeing it with your own eyes. And they basically gave the Christians those 3 options. You convert, but because you're a Christian, then you can stay a Christian, but you have to pay this high form of penalty, or else you face a sword. That was the first jihad. Just as an aside, for you theological students, you must understand, here's another item in history to do with biblical